Amnesty International came out with their report on human rights abuses in 1979 and listed areas around the world where there were various arrests, disappearances, imprisonments, and mentioned the Soviet Union that had political dissidents that are still sent to psychiatric institutions. Pravda answered that this week with a charge that the United States should look in its own backyard, that Jimmy Carter has political assassinations and political murders in the United States. I thought that was interesting because the Soviet Union has been very quiet about the assassinations in this country. They went on to say that the International Human Rights Day was a mockery, considering the murdering of political opponents in the United States. And the article said, how do millions of U.S. blacks, Americans of Mexican descent, American Indians, reduced to the position of second-rate citizens, see their life? What do more than 6 million unemployed people think about the right to happiness? The article goes into the killing of Puerto Rican activists recently and the hanging in the jail of an activist that set off the shooting down in Puerto Rico last week on the Navy bus. It refers to these shootings and goes on to say that the United States has, in quotes, thousands of political crimes which are committed by the FBI and in point of fact by the government of the United States under the cover of talks of human rights. So that Pravda was answering Jimmy Carter and saying, your opponents at election time are killed, you murder your political opponents in the United States, and even the FBI is involved in the assassinations. I do think in time that the Soviet Union will get more vocal about the assassinations in the United States if we keep slandering their particular activities. I'm not implying that the Soviet Union is perfect or their justice system is perfect, but I do know that their intelligence operations certainly know about Yuri Nosenko and Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald and the connecting links of the Navy intelligence to our political assassination of John Kennedy alone. But I often felt that the factor keeping them from getting in a global confrontation with us, at least to this point, would be blackmail on the various assassinations. And I just think it's interesting that it's coming out at this time. There's one article that was of interest, and I want to share it with you before we go back to the Iranian subject. In fact, there are 4 or 5 articles I want to update with you. This one has to do with microwave ovens and radio telescopes, in case any of you have them. I'm sure my listeners to these tapes don't have microwave ovens, but some that listen to the tapes on radio programs might have them or think of getting them. Jodrell Bank is an observatory in England, and they're complaining, the astronomers at this powerful radio telescope at Jodrell Bank, that microwave ovens being used in home kitchens in England are destroying the radio frequencies. They said, in quotes, the seals around the doors of such ovens have a tendency to leak microwaves that are outside the frequency band reserved for microwave ovens by international agreement. The leading microwaves have a frequency identical to several protected radio bands for radio astronomers and for radio waves emitted from celestial objects, and that these spurious emissions from the microwave ovens present a serious danger to radio astronomical researchers. I'm reading this. It's a report from a magazine that just came out recently on the problems of Jodrell Bank, and they were saying that even a microwave oven a half a mile from this center in Great Britain, this powerful radio telescope observatory place in Great Britain, would interfere with their waves, and even a microwave oven a mile or 15 miles to Jodrell Bank interferes with their telescopes and their range and the use of the radio and the installations and the communication systems. Now, if there's that much leaking from a microwave oven that's affecting something so remote in space that even a single microwave oven 15 miles from the telescope is changing the emissions that are coming through that radio because of the microwave oven leaking, I wonder what in the world these ovens are doing to human beings, or how much is getting into their body. It said Jodrell Bank is concerned about the use of ovens in the vicinity. I wonder if the real story will be out within the next few years of what these microwave ovens can do to human beings, if they're leaking that much that they're affecting communications with space just through the radio waves at Jodrell Bank. For those of you that don't have my tapes, on Alternative 3, you have a list of suggested subjects in the past that I've done. You might update the tapes that I have, and I just want to mention for those of you that have the book Alternative 3 or do have the tapes, there was an article in the Los Angeles Times Thursday, December the 6th, Industry in Space, It's Only a Question of Time. And the article is about the globe with its overpopulation, too many people to feed, again, and the space will be the frontier for aluminum, titanium, iron, and silicon. And it refers again to Gerard O'Neill, the scientist from Princeton, who's building these space colonies. And the article goes on to say the question is not whether space can be industrialized, but how soon it will happen. And this article is about the space colonies and using them for the overpopulated Earth. I thought it was interesting that this week the President of the United States and his wife were involved with a new commission to double the effort to feed the world starving. Now, the years that Jimmy Carter's been president, all this human rights talk was a lot of baloney. There's been more repressions, more murders, more killing and silencing of people around the world, more bloodshed going on constantly as he talks of human rights. And now he has a new commission on world hunger, and I hope that that commission doesn't coincide with Gerard O'Neill at Princeton, because the whole theory behind the space colony is to relieve the Earth of 80% of its population and put them up there to work and make these microwaves that will come back to the Earth for energy and be using the minerals that are up in the moon and other places up in space. 250,000 miles up between Earth and the moon will become an economic development zone. And this is in the Los Angeles Times, and it describes various space persons that have gone into industrialization, and it begins with Wernher von Braun in 1952, who proposed a space station that housed 80 people, and then in 1967 they developed an orbital hotel, and in 1974 the space colony idea got moving, thanks to Gerard O'Neill. This is a long article on a space colony coming out just at the same time that the President of the United States has his commission for the world starving, and the whole theory of the space colonies is to eliminate the world of these masses of people and get rid of them up there in the space colonies. Representative Leo Ryan's son asked members of the House Foreign Affairs Committee to conduct a thorough investigation into how Leo Ryan died and how the deaths took place down at People's Temple. And he refers to reports that were issued by the State Department and the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that no hearings have been held to investigate this matter. And it's an interesting thing. He said in an interview following his speech, Ryan said he believes the tragic events of Guyana could have been avoided if the State Department and the Justice Department had acted on complaints of the People's Temple that date back to 1972. Now, those are the years where I said People's Temple began, when the leasing began around 1972 or 73 is when they first sent the first people down there. And there were already complaints about them, and on other tapes on Jonestown, I linked it to the UCLA school to study the causes of violent behavior, that they were going to use human beings, poor blacks, Mexicans, Indians, for medical experimentation. Incidentally, the man, that Dr. Jolly West, who runs that UCLA school, he's the head of the neuropsychiatric department at UCLA, but was to run this study for the causes of violence. He was on television this week with interviews regarding brainwashing of the hostages in Iran. He's used for all kinds of government military opinions on brainwashing, and Dr. Jolly West was stopped at UCLA from his projects, which I have on earlier tapes, and I believe that Jonestown was moving the UCLA School of Experimentation down to Guyana. And it's interesting that Leo Ryan's son says that the problems began with complaints going back as early as 1972, that the State Department and the Justice Department totally ignored, and he feels if they had the true information on what the early complaints were, they would find out how his father died and why he was sent down there to die. The Hells Angels trials going on in California now. That's a complicated trial of 18 people in a federal court. At one time, Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels was used as an agent provocateur to set up violence at the Altamont concert of the Rolling Stones, and they made a movie, Gimme Shelter, where a gentleman was killed right on camera a Mr. Meredith, and Sonny Barger had worked with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. And at the course of their trial, which is going on in San Francisco for murder and drug and all kinds of narcotics dealing and so forth, these 18 Hells Angels, one defense attorney that they have, a Mr. Archuleta, Ray Archuleta, didn't show up last week because he was found in the bathtub. He was dizzy and had passed out, and he didn't show up in court, and the judge scolded him and said, "You better be there the next day. We don't believe a word of what you're saying." And a few days later, after this defense lawyer said he had a concussion from a fall in his home, his brother was killed in an automobile accident on Skyline Boulevard up near San Francisco. And his brother, the paper said, was an electrician for Bethlehem Steel Corporation. But the interesting thing in the San Francisco Chronicle account of the death of the brother of the defense attorney was that it said police contacted an agent for Treasury Department's Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which notified attorney Ray Archuleta, 34, of the accident when his brother was killed when he arrived in federal court yesterday morning. Now, I have tape recordings of conversations procured by Larry Shears of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms when Sonny Barger was working for them as an assassin or a potential assassination team to wipe out people like Eldridge Cleaver and Cesar Chavez. And it's interesting that the defense attorney for the Hells Angel had a near miss where he almost died this week. But when his brother died, the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, the same agency that had hired Sonny Barger and the Hells Angels at one time, were the people that informed him of his brother's death. You'd think that ordinary police would call him and go to his home, or other law enforcement people, members of the family, but they specified that agents of alcohol, tobacco, and firearms notified the attorney. So in some way, the defense attorney and Sonny Barger and alcohol, tobacco, and firearms are still involved in protecting the Hells Angels and maybe get them off the hook. They're still involved with that family that's defending them. And it's interesting that the name of that agency comes out because I've said on the radio and other tapes that Sonny Barger himself worked for that agency. The Pope is cracking down. He had his council where he's missing $20 million a year, and the cardinals went home. Now there's an article in the Washington Post this last week. Vatican shows sign of a crackdown on intellectual freedom. The Polish Pope has made his trip to the United States. He has been linked to organized crime. His bank's linked to 3 deaths in Italy and to Mr. Sindona, and that trial still isn't going through. It's very quiet in New York. The taking of money, manipulation of millions of dollars of private money and Vatican money is still in limbo. But the Pope is showing his fangs now, just as Jimmy Carter is showing his, and he is cracking down, according to the Washington Post and New York Times, on what they call intellectual freedom. He's having a trial, a Holy Inquisition, the Office of the Holy Inquisition, for the first time this last week on Edward Shillaboo. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but I'll spell it for you on the sheet of paper. A theologian, and they're having a secret trial of the Holy Inquisition, and then he's checking out another theologian who is under examination, a Jesuit priest, Reverend William Callahan, who's been disciplined, and he's asked to crack down, as it says, on intellectual freedom. The New York Times has a report, Jesuit chief at Pope's request orders an end of their shortcomings. This is Robert Blair Kaiser. And shortcomings means being liberal, being secularized, being involved in quotes, political and social issues. The church's involvement, the Jesuits, some of them have gotten involved in political and social issues. And Pope John Paul II is now beginning to show his little fascist fangs, and he is cracking down on various members of the church, as I say, reviving the Holy Office of the Inquisition and convening with theological trials which haven't been done. And the newspaper, the New York Times, said the very idea of such a trial has a chilling effect on theologians who profess an ethical commitment to assume a critical posture towards their own beliefs. And the purpose of these trials is to shut them up and quit their liberalizing and get back in the fold, so that he is cracking down on them and intends to be very rigid I'm sure that the facade, this smiling Pope that kisses all the babies and kisses the ground, is a very extreme right-wing Pope and not the kindly, friendly man, the image that he tries to portray. So it's interesting that the newspapers now are covering articles about the sternness of his political position. There's an article in the Dallas Morning News, November 22nd, the anniversary of John Kennedy's death, talking about the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and the title of the article by Earl Goltz is "The Public Once Again in Dark on Assassinations." But one of the most disgusting stories, this was carried in the news in Texas, not out here, was that when the House Select Committee on Assassinations completed their $6 million investigation into Kennedy's assassination, which is the second investigation, first the Warren Report in 1964 and this report in 1979, the committee put a 50-year secrecy lid on the testimony reports and other documents that they've collected from private researchers and their own hearings, and they've locked all of this up, and they've published 25 volumes and a final report, but they have piles of information that's locked away for 50 years, restricted automatically for 50 years not to be released. And this is kept from various people, the testimony of very important witnesses that would probably prove that a conspiracy existed. G. Robert Blakey was chief counsel of this committee to investigate the assassination of John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King. And there's a quotation. He says, in quotes, "He is sure the critics are uptight about the restrictions." Critics, meaning writers and researchers who've been investigating these assassinations. Robert Blakey said, in quotes, "They would have preferred to have gotten immediate access to everything," immediate access. This is Robert Blakey, now a professor at Cornell University Law School. He was before, and he went back there. And the answer is they will if they are historians and if they live long enough. I'm 57. That means I'd be 107 before I'd get to see some of that. And I'm sure there are no 5-year-olds around now that are interested in the Kennedy assassination or in Martin Luther King's murder at this time. The article tells how all of this has been locked up for 50 years, and then it goes on to say that there's no index even of witness testimony, the witnesses that they called, so that we know which witnesses were called before the committee. Their report doesn't have an index like the Warren report did of the witnesses who were called. And Blakey said there was a central index for every document the committee used, and it's a shame, but it's accompanying the restricted material, and it's out of reach of the public. It's in the National Archives. So when historians come, if they ever do, and I don't know if they will really care 50 years from now about this particular committee, this is what Blakey said, it's locked up. And also locked up is the information about Lee Harvey Oswald's trip to Mexico City. The Mexico City area was very important, and also sealed away for 50 years is an interview with Will Fritz. He was head of the homicide responsible for the investigation of the murder of John Kennedy, the man who closed the case Sunday evening, the same night that Lee Harvey Oswald was murdered by Jack Ruby. This material, Will Fritz, has been locked up for 50 years. He was called evidently by the House Select Committee, and whatever he had to say is locked up, and other important information. So whatever the House Select Committee had on the assassinations, it will not be available to us. It's locked up for 50 years, and it would take some order of Congress to open the seal from the records. The clerk would have to have the Rules Committee remove the seal from these records. I really think that this country is pathetically stupid and in the control of the hands of a few people. And this information, as I say, came from the Dallas Morning News. It wasn't in any of the other wire services around the country. That nobody will have access to this information for 50 more years. The Washington Post ran a story December the 4th, 1979. I didn't have a time to put on my tapes the last few weeks about the CIA testing biological warfare in New York, on the streets of New York. It involved open-air biological tests in 1955 and 1956. Unknown substances from aerosol devices were put in suitcases and also in the exhaust of a specially built 1953 Mercury automobile plan. This was part of the CIA's mind control experiment programs, and they were testing biological warfare experiments. This one was called Operation Big City. That was the code name, and since that time the CIA has destroyed or hidden from classification a lot of this information. Part of this has been declassified through the Freedom of Information Act and given to the Scientologists, the church that has been prosecuted recently for infiltrating the federal government. But I think we need them and should support their efforts. 5 of their top officials have been arrested. But they got a hold of reports from the Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland, of mind and medical body tests that were done from 1949 to 1968 and then up through the 70s. The one I talked about on a tape a few weeks ago or months ago was over the Golden Gate Bridge in 1950, where they had biological warfare, and then there was another testing over Utah, the clouds for delirium, and this other paper that's been declassified, as I say, is called Operation Big City. And in the tailpipes of Mercury automobile, they had an extra 18 inches that was filled, I guess, with some chemical. It extended 18 inches from the tailpipe. And then they put chemicals to, I guess, catch the reaction of people or to see if they were contaminated. And the results of this kind of operation have never been disclosed, but I wonder if there's any incidence of cancer or mental disease from people that were close to these chemicals during this time period. That's quite a long time period in 1955 and 1956 to be riding around with this mercury and spraying people. Operation Big City, it was called. Now I want to spend the rest of the time on this tape, on this side and on the other side, on the Shah of Iran and the Iranian problem. Some very interesting articles coming out. And I want to bring up the idea with you that I'm going to lead to is that the Shah of Iran is possibly, he's not just here for humanitarian reasons because he was sick. There's the possibility that he's actually kept a prisoner at the army base, and the reason he can't go to Argentina or Panama or South Africa is that the United States is not going to let him out of their hands. There is the possibility that more is involved. We know that much more is involved than meets the eye or the mind, and accumulating in the newspapers are little pieces and clues to the puzzles, and I want to throw a few of these out to you and see how you feel about them. Henry Kissinger was on Dick Cavett 2 nights, an interview with Dick Cavett last Thursday, December the 6th, and Kissinger was talking about Watergate, and he was bragging about the fact that when Richard Nixon's mind was faltering, Dick Cavett asked him, weren't you worried that he would flip or go over the deep end and lose his mind? And Kissinger went on to say that when Nixon's mind was faltering, when he was almost on the verge of going out of his mind, I ran the country, he said in quotes. I ran the country. I made the foreign policy. Now that, the period of 72, 73, it was in the summer of 72 when the men were caught at Watergate. And what happened when they were caught at Watergate and that tape was left on the door, and Richard Nixon began to fall down, in came General Haig and Henry Kissinger to hold the place together until in 1973, just the time that Nixon is faltering, Mr. Brzezinski and David Rockefeller have gone down to the South to get Jimmy Carter from Annapolis, the graduate of Annapolis, to be their next president of the United States. So it seems that the Watergate story, and you read the Iranian story, and I'm going to try to tie this together, involves Kissinger and Rockefeller, the demise of Nixon, the putting in of Carter, and holding now the Shah of Iran as captive to protect the investments in the Chase Manhattan Bank, because there seems to be evidence that a counter team, just as there was a counter team in the White House between Nixon and this gang that got him out of office, there's a gang that was going to kidnap the Shah of Iran and maybe take over that turf market, the narcotics market, the opium, for coming in from Iran and Afghanistan and Turkey, because his sister and he were very much involved in a large narcotics operation. And I think that the drug problem and the Carters linked to the people involved in the drug war is very important. This is a little complicated, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can, getting into some of these points. The first point being that Henry Kissinger talked about when Nixon was going out of his zonkers and couldn't hold together that he ran the country. Well, Kissinger's background with Rockefeller goes back to when he came here from Germany, was at Harvard, a protege of Rockefeller. They're blood brothers, and he has represented the Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan, Exxon investments all over the world as Secretary of State and head of the National Security Council. There was an article in the paper this last week, very interesting article, about a new version of the Watergate Mystery Man, and it's a CIA agent, Richard Ober. And the article goes on to say, it's from a quotation from a new book out by Deborah Davis called Catherine the Great, about Catherine Graham in the Washington Post. And it says Richard Ober, was one of the few CIA men who Nixon trusted. He operated in the White House office. He had access to all classified information. He could see Nixon any time. He went in and out without signing daily logs. And Ober became a double agent in the White House, in quotes, for those who wanted the President of the United States to fall. Well, he would have to be a double agent then for Mr. David Rockefeller and Nelson Rockefeller, because when Nixon fell, as I say, Haig and Kissinger were the ones who had total control of the White House. The article says that he worked with Benjamin Bradley, who was formerly or still is with the CIA, who's the executive director of the Washington Post. They were undergraduates at Harvard University in 1944, where Kissinger was teaching at Harvard. It was attended Harvard, which was a nest of CIA spies and always has been. And this article says that Ober, as a favor to Bradley, fed him stories, and he was the deep throat, and then Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were assigned to get Nixon out of office by leaking a certain amount of the stories. The article says Ober recruited the plumbers, James McCord and the others, and he persuaded James McCord to reveal at his court arraignment that he once worked for the CIA, and McCord went up to the judge and said, I worked for the CIA. And this article says that the entire Watergate story, which we all know, was a counterintelligence operation. Deep Throat was working behind the scenes for another power. And then he goes on to say in this article, this was from this week's paper, it's from Newhouse News Service, that the motive grew out of Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, that there was a disastrous policy in Cambodia, that he was getting the blame, and the CIA, he disregarded the CIA advice, and when it failed, he blamed the CIA over in Cambodia. And that Nixon, when he appeared insane, seemed dangerous as the head of state and so forth. So for patriotic reasons, they decided, the intelligence directors, that they had to get Nixon out for patriotic reasons. So double agent Ober was feeding James McCord, who then was arrested, and McCord was the man who was supposed to have left the tape on the door, McCord went to the judge and broke the whole story open and began to feed. Deep Throat was feeding Woodward and Bernstein enough stories to get Richard Nixon out of office, but to make sure that Henry Kissinger and General Haig were running the White House all of this time. And in 73, as I say, when Haig and Kissinger were running the White House, David Rockefeller had selected his next president down there in Georgia. A lot of people have asked me about the Trilateral Commission. July 28, 1978, that's tape 340. I have the address of where people can get books and literature on the Trilateral Commission, so that I'm not going to do a whole tape on that now. I want to get back to the Iranian problem. But in 1973, the Trilateral Commission, that's when Nixon was having all of his problems, went down and selected Jimmy Carter to represent them for the next stage of control over the White House. In 1973, David Rockefeller created the Trilateral Commission, and that's when Mr. Brzezinski and his gang decided, as I say, that Jimmy Carter would be the man that would carry on for them in the next stage. This side of the tape, I'm going to ask some questions with you or share some information and talk about the Kissinger, David Rockefeller, Shah of Iran, Jimmy Carter connections to what's going on with the crisis that keeps building up overseas, and the unanswered questions, or maybe the questions that the right questions aren't being asked. Jack Anderson has had two good articles this past week. One, early warnings about the Shah of Iran, and he brings up the subject that in the back room of Washington, everyone seemed to know that the Shah was bad news. He says the State Department didn't want him in the United States, and the Central Intelligence Agency was against bringing the Shah of Iran here. Both of them were against it. So why would Jimmy Carter go against the State Department, and why would he go against the Central Intelligence Agency? Who else would want him here? There would only be three agencies or persons then that would want him in the United States. One, the Defense Department, because it would be the excuse to get that increased budget we're getting, an excuse to force Europe to put their nuclear missiles on the base, to get more warheads, to get more ships. We're going to increase by billions of dollars that budget and use our military that's becoming very heroic to defend us, so that the Defense Department came out ahead on this. Jimmy Carter came out ahead. As I said weeks ago, some people didn't believe me when I was talking about it on the tape, that there's a war president. The people are rallying around him, the family of the hostages. One woman was on TV with Barbara Walters. If her husband died, she's used to sacrifice. There wouldn't be anything wrong with it. The Defense Department comes out winning, the National Security Agency, and also the people that have the Shah in this country, who probably are controlling that narcotics market. So the people that would gain from him being here, even if the CIA and the State Department didn't want it, would be those particular agencies. And also that Kissinger-Rockefeller combine, because those billions of dollars of the Shah's money went into that bank, which would be bankrupt or damaged seriously if it was pulled out. And also, if the Shah were overseas, as I say, in other countries, if he started to talk about what he knows, this country would be down on its knees if he was angry enough after being deposed and sent out to let him be in any other country. Well, Jack Anderson asked why, if the CIA and the State Department didn't want him, how did he get here? He said that Cyrus Vance had warned of the dangers in July 26th of the actions of having him here. He used the name of a David Newsom. Remember that name, because it'll come out later in future history or operations, just like Jolly West's name comes out all the time, that he was privy to the warnings, and one of the men in the State Department who handled the Shah's case in coming here. And another man was Henry Precht, who headed the Iranian desk at the State Department and was in touch of matters and knew it was combustible, but went ahead with the plans. Jack Anderson then went on to say that he asked, why was the Shah here? The compelling question is why? Why were our leaders determined to admit the Shah? Why did they do it? Contrary to the best interest of the United States, Jack Anderson is asking, and loyalty can't be the only justification. He said their greater obligation was not to the Shah, but it should have been to the national interest. The pressure came primarily from David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger. Despite the disclaimers, there was a relentless campaign in Washington. The Rockefeller-Kissinger alibi that they only made limited personal contacts is pure deception. They directed the campaign, they pulled the strings, they enlisted others to join in the pressure. And Jack Anderson says they have multi-million-dollar financial ties to the Shah, but they also have Kissinger and Haig and Brzezinski and their Trilateral Commission in charge of the White House, and I think they would prefer a war rather than give up that power. And that's why they insisted on bringing the Shah here, because then it brings military altercations, protects their banking interests, and keeps their power. Their power is definitely behind Jimmy Carter, and all of a sudden the Shah comes here, and Jimmy Carter's rating, according to the polls, makes the biggest jump of any president since the last war. And Ted Kennedy, who said the Shah was a crook and stole from his people and was cruel, his so-called ratings go down. The next day, Jack Anderson had another important article called Kissinger Blamed for the Iranian Crisis. Now remember, Mr. Kissinger is the man who took credit for stepping in and running the White House when Richard Nixon cracked up. He also had a big role in overthrowing Allende in Chile, in the Cambodia bombings, and a lot of disasters that have happened to their country. Anderson said that Kissinger's responsibility The oil prices going up in 1973 is well known. He had written about that, and I've done other tapes on that. That Rockefeller was the benefactor of the increased oil prices. He refers to the close relationship that Kissinger and Rockefeller have had for years, that's gone on for many, many years, that Rockefeller has appointed Kissinger to take care of their investments, and he's behind the Rockefeller family international contacts. I've talked on tapes about the Saudi Arabia interest in holding down the oil price, and how King Faisal was murdered, and 2 days after Kissinger was there in Saudi Arabia, and then the prices jumped up, and this increase of oil prices made more money for the oil companies and for Exxon and Standard Oil. And he also goes into the background of how Mossadegh was nationalizing the oil companies, and the CIA was closely tied to the Rockefeller interests, and put the Shah in 1953, and in return the dominant oil company for the American Iranian Oil Consortium that once belonged to the British Oil Company in Iran went to Exxon, and therefore then the Shah made Chase Manhattan his favorite bank and put his money there, and the oil prices quadrupled 4 times over. So Jack Anderson goes into the close relationship of the Shah to Chase Manhattan and Kissinger to Chase, and the policies of Kissinger allowing the oil prices to go up. There's that very close bond between the profits of oil, the profits of banking, and the Shah as a person. But then there were other articles that were interesting that came out, one in the New York Times, December the 7th. The Shah says that the U.S. aided to overthrow him. Now, this is where the conflict comes in, and this is a little complicated. I hope I'm not going too fast, but the beauty of these tapes as against radio programs is you can't play them over and over. And if it's not clear, if the point isn't clear, I can update it on another tape if you write to me. The groundwork is set that Henry Kissinger runs the White House. He is in Nixon's office. Haig is running the office. They represent Nelson, David Rockefeller, Chase Manhattan, and so forth. But their baby is overthrown in Iran, kicked out. How did he get out? If they were doing so well and had those investments, how did they get out? Now, the Shah is coming out with a book, The Deposed Shah, in which he praises Henry Kissinger and even Nixon and blames Jimmy Carter for getting him out of office. He says he was neutralized, that American General Robert Hauser, Huyser, came to Tehran, and all he was concerned about was when the Shah was going to leave. That he went over to visit him in January of last year, and Hauser arrived in Tehran for the clear purpose of neutralizing the Iranian army. Now, why would Hauser want to get the Shah out? The Shah says that this happened. He said American Ambassador William Sullivan was with him, and he said all they wanted to know is what day I was leaving. Now, that doesn't make sense. If the Shah is so entrenched with all of his arms and weapons, and Kissinger and David Rockefeller and that gang on his side, somebody was trying to get the Shah out, and why? And he has a book, an installment coming, How the Americans Overthrew Me. Now, I believe that he's a captive on this military base, as I said, on the other side, because if he went to another country, he would talk too much. And General Haig has said the reason that he left NATO was that this Hauser, Huyser, was sent there, and that they got rid of the Shah. The Shah said at the beginning of January, the Carter administration decided to advise the Shah that it would be best for Iran if he left the country. And he repeats several times. Another thing, in the New York Times, in his memoirs, he says that when the general went to Tehran in January, he was sent there by the Carter administration, and the Carters wanted the Shah out of Iran. Now, Jimmy Carter was put in by the Trilateral Commission and David Rockefeller, but someone behind Carter, and I believe it has to do with the Georgia drug connections. I think Carter is torn 2 ways down the middle, one with the Georgia narcotics connections, and the others with the northern eastern banker, the Wall Street bankers. And I think both factors had a piece of them in the White House, but that the southern factor used pressure on Jimmy Carter to get the Shah out. There was an article in the Washington Post, December the 6th, this last week. Many doctors think the Shah could have stayed in Mexico. And it goes on to say that only one doctor, Dr. Benjamin Keene from New York Hospital Cornell, who's a specialist in tropical diseases, not cancer or gastric diseases, and this hospital is heavily endowed by the Rockefeller family, and Lawrence Rockefeller is a life member of the hospital board. This one doctor went down, as against any other doctors that were consulted or identified, or Mexican doctors, and brought the Shah up to New York City. He could have stayed in Mexico. Other people are doing investigative work, the Mayo Clinic, the Boston Globe, and refers to investigations that he could have been in other places. But I believe that once he was out, once Jimmy Carter and that faction had gotten the Shah out, it was very important to David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger that they have him in this country and not in any other country, and I feel that he is a semi-prisoner kept on a military base in Texas, and that the medical was the excuse to get him here before he continued talking or writing memoirs or went to another country, and that Rockefeller and Kissinger quick grabbed him up here to protect him before he went elsewhere and began to talk more about his anger about the Carter other faction that got him out of office. Now, one of the clues to this question may be brought up in several articles that are very important. The question of the Shah and the conflict of Jimmy Carter getting the Shah out of his peacock throat in Iran, and the question of why he's in the United States at this time. Last week on tape 418 on the Iranian crisis, I quoted Maxine Cheshire, an article in the Washington Post, on Rosalind Carter, who was photographed with a man, Jimmy Eppoletto, who's linked with organized crime, narcotics, loan shark figure, involved in a hashish investigation in Manhattan that involved $50 million. And that appointment, as I said, was set up by John Ellsworth. I've talked about John Ellsworth on another tape. He's a convicted felon, a person that was in the White House with Jimmy Carter, Rosalind Carter last year, and set up this meeting with Eppoletto of organized crime. Well, Maxine Cheshire came out with a marvelous article just this week, 1 week later, in her column. It's called VIP. It's the Washington Post, December the 2nd, 1979. And she goes more into that mysterious connection of John Ellsworth that I brought up last week and several weeks ago. John Ellsworth was also the gentleman who worked for the Rolling Stones Orchestra at the time that the concert was out at Altamont that was set up with the Hells Angels, and Melvin Belli, the attorney for Jack Ruby, working with the CIA, also set up the Hells Angels as a security, and Sonny Barger, the defendant in that trial out here at the Hells Angel trial. Well, this counterintelligence agent by the name of John Ellsworth, worked with that team and was out here. He was even photographed in the movie. He used the name John James. That was his alias, and he was filmed in that movie at Altamont as an agent of. He was an agent of the federal government. Well, Ellsworth's first contacts with Jimmy Carter were down in the South in 1976. He was making a movie which was never produced, a documentary movie, and then he went in the White House for his International Children's Appeal. He was going to raise money for children. This was that fraudulent front for an organized crime operation. But this article, The Mysterious Ellsworth, goes into more details about the Middle East and the possible kidnapping of the Shah that may give a little more light into the complicated Carter organized crime connections in the South. This article tells about Mrs. Carter. She went to a luncheon out of the executive office building. It was for Cities in Schools, a favorite project of hers, and this Ellsworth gave her $7,500 for the project. Isaac Hayes, the black musician, gave a concert at Constitution Hall, and then he gave her $60,000 or $70,000 for this project. And what he got in return was calling cards with Chip Carter's name on them for an operation that he was involved in. Now, John Ellsworth was not only involved as an agent for 7 government agencies. They're listed in the Washington Post, the various agencies he's worked for. He's been an informant for the Secret Service, the FBI, the Internal Revenue, Drug Enforcement, the CIA, and the Organized Crime Task Force as a government investigator with links to organized crime. But this John Ellsworth has an organization, this International Children's Appeal, that is set up by a group of businessmen that Maxine Chesser writes about, independent businessmen. And she goes into the background of some of the businessmen who are involved with Ellsworth, who not only was photographed with Mrs. Carter and set up a party at the White House at Christmas, but he was there again concerning Middle East affairs. He had a girlfriend, and in March of '79, Ellsworth and his girlfriend were again part of the White House party at the dinner when Egypt and Israeli peace treaties were signed. A very important event, remember it, out in the garden with the tent at the White House. And this party, in quotes, helped expand his Middle East operations. He had business partners for this front, this International Children's Appeal, and these are some of the partners he had. For one thing, this Children's Appeal used toy sales that were a front for loan sharking and narcotics operations. Then he had another business partner. This is one of the business partners of John Ellsworth, was a friend of PLO leader Yasser Arafat. And as she said in the Washington Post, that they had plans to take over all hashish growing and trafficking out of Lebanon. That is quite a bit of an operation, because they were arrested in a $50 million hashish operation in New York City, this gang. But they were friends of Arafat's working on drug traffic, the takeover of all hash out of Lebanon. Another partner of this group schemed to kidnap the Shah of Iran, and they were going to use this ransom money for other purposes. Now, this is interesting that the Carters' buddies, this guy that's been in the White House several times, and she's been photographed with their buddies, had a plan, and it doesn't give the date of it, of kidnapping the Shah. Now, if they were going to kidnap him to get rid of him, they could also remove him, such as he blames Jimmy Carter for getting him out of office. So that one of the business partners or groups of John Ellsworth, one of their projects was to kidnap or get rid of the Shah of Iran. They used a toy factory in New York, as I say, for covering their operations. And one of their partners was dealing in laser guns, weapons that could cut trees in half. They had a catalog of laser weapons and were manufacturing these and selling them. Another partner was drilling for oil in Ghana and building a hotel in Cairo with Anwar Sadat's son-in-law as a co-investor. And they were negotiating contracts to split $2 million fees to send Muhammad Ali to the Middle East. In other words, this John Ellsworth, who's at the White House photographed with Rosalind Carter at Christmas time or at the Hilton Hotel with members of organized crime, who has a front for loan sharking and so forth. These partners of his are very important people when they talk about the entire hash market out of part of the Middle East, or kidnapping the Shah, or distributing laser guns, or oil in Ghana, or hotels with Sadat's relatives in Cairo, or bringing Muhammad Ali to the Middle East. There's a lot of weight here. Another partner planned to use Carter's contracts to produce a $10 million TV series about presidential assistance. The International Children's Appeal was going to bring in millions, even billions of dollars, and one deal alone was to bring in $400 million. Ellsworth was already rich. He had blown $2.8 million on living since he began this International Children's Group, using the aliases of John, James, Clifford, Ellsworth, and Thomas Fiorello. This character and his partners are terribly important. As I say, they're linked to the Secret Service, the FBI, the Internal Revenue, the CIA. Joey the priest was a person that set up a toy operation that actually was involved with topless bars. 4 of his members of that group were arrested on extortion charges, and 16 of them were indicted in New York City in April '79 for hash, cocaine, and marijuana. When James and Jimmy Eppoletto were murdered after they were photographed with Rosalind Carter, and people thought that Ellsworth and the Eppolettos were getting too visible, Ellsworth got a phone call saying, take care of the Eppoletto family, don't be too curious, and take care of the widow financially, which is, of course, an organized crime tradition. Now, John Ellsworth claims he works for the CIA, that he's taken a fall for the CIA, that they owe him money, that he was once involved with a Russian spy ship in Galveston, Texas, in a $6 million meat deal. He also claims he tipped the CIA off that their station chief was going to be assassinated in Athens 6 months before it happened. Remember when the station chief was murdered over there, Mr. Welch, and they blamed Philip Agee and the investigations of the CIA on that this murder took place? Well, Ellsworth claims that they knew 6 months before it happened that the station chief was going to be murdered. So he has a lot of information and works with counterintelligence and worked with assassination teams in Turkey. He talks about his assassination team work in Turkey and working with the Secret Service. And when he went before a federal judge in Brooklyn in 1976, he beat the charges because government agencies sent letters on the behalf that said he worked for government agencies. He also claimed that he was responsible with breaking the story of Club 54 in New York City. He got in a fight with one of the owners, Steve Rubel, at a Halloween fundraising party in 1978 and began their troubles with the federal government. Now, what you have here in all this story, this Maxine Cheshire story, is the Carters' associations with persons that have contacts in the Middle East. They not only have them, but Ellsworth is at the White House at a party at the time of the Begin-Sadat meeting, and they obviously have contacts in the drug community in Georgia and around Georgia. And the necessity of getting the Shah removed may have something to do with the narcotics traffic in Asia. It may serve two purposes. It may strengthen the Pentagon as an excuse for war, and it may leave the drug opening to the narcotic dealers. This happened in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam, in the Golden Triangle, that the Pentagon and the warmongers got their contracts and their prestige, and the narcotic traffic escalated domestically so that the mafia made money off the dope, and the military establishment received more power and control because of the war that was going on. Now, just this week, Mr. Civiletti, Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti, disclosed that he had to remove himself from the investigation of the White House influence buying. There's an investigation into financier Robert Vesco. Now, Vesco has worked with the CIA, the narcotics divisions. He's been involved with drug traffic, assassination teams, and Vesco's been floating around since Watergate. He ripped off one company for $400 million, the Investment Overseas Organization, and he has been linked through Bobby Hall and Howard Hughes' organization when he was down in Costa Rica to assassination teams and worldwide narcotic traffic. And now there's a hearing, a grand jury hearing in Washington, D.C. that involves the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, and a question about whether he has not extradited Vesco, that he was paid off or there was a payment to keep Vesco free. Now, again, this links Jimmy Carter to the Vesco connections, and his own Attorney General has gone off the Vesco investigation. He disclosed he had to remove himself from the government investigation of allegations of White House influence buying on behalf of the fugitive financier Robert Vesco. In January 1977, Jimmy Carter came into office, and he manned R.L. Herring, Herring, from Georgia, a businessman. I have to look up the records. I believe he was involved also in the Allman Brothers and the musical connections to Jimmy Carter. A Georgia businessman was convicted of federal fraud, and there were stories that he had paid $10,000 to a W. Spencer Lee from Georgia for Robert Vesco, that he had given the money to Lee on behalf of Robert Vesco, who is a fugitive, as I say, and should be brought back to the United States for trial. But then Mr. Lee went to Washington, D.C. and met with a Richard Hardin, a White House aide, in February of 77. That was a month after Carter was in office. And then Hardin, the White House aide, met with Jimmy Carter. And they decided at that time, evidently, not to extradite Robert Vesco. And Carter sent a note to Attorney General Griffin Bell, his attorney from Georgia, who went on to be the Attorney General of the United States, and it said, "Please see Spencer Lee from Albany, Georgia." Mr. Lee was the person that had been contacted. There were several chains of command, as I say, from Mr. Herring to Mr. Spencer Lee, and then Mr. Lee to the White House aide, Hardin, and the Hardin to Jimmy Carter, and then Carter sent a note to the Attorney General, "Please see Spencer Lee, the man who allegedly was paid $10,000 for the contact." And what happened was that Robert Vesco was never extradited. There have been many articles that we can do later on Billy Carter wanting to be a lobbyist for Gaddafi and working in the Middle East, and also allegedly working with Robert Vesco, so that you get this drug connection assassination teams, the Middle East operations, this John Ellsworth and Rosalind Carter connections. And I think there is much more to the Carters with their southern contacts as much as there is to their trilateral northern contacts. As I say, I think there's a split there. And because the Shah's family was so notoriously into the narcotic business, it's interesting that if he's kept here, as I believe he could be, if he was going to be kidnapped to take over the drug turf, a perfect way to take over his operations or to silence him would to keep him from getting back into them or continuing them, or his family continuing them, and by having him on the army base, he's literally just tied up, and his money is stuck there in Chase Manhattan with David Rockefeller and Henry Kissinger, and they have their Shah sitting at an army base where they can keep a good eye on him instead of being in Mexico or Panama or Argentina or Paraguay or Uruguay or South Africa. He's very safe, even at the risk of going into World War III, because, as I say, the Pentagon wouldn't think it was a risk. It's helped Jimmy Carter, and it gives him more powers, more money for weapons. So the Shah is serving several purposes by sitting down at the Army base in Texas the same way. Jimmy Carter came in as a man representing the oil companies, with links down in Georgia, the assassination teams and organized crime, and a Annapolis graduate from the military. And as President of the United States, in the 3 years that he's been there, he has served his masters well. No matter what you think of Mealy Mouse Carter, he has served David Rockefeller, the Pentagon. He is in the news this last week asking for more nuclear weapons, nuclear rapid deployment forces, increase of the Pentagon budget. He has his Shah tucked away. The families of the hostages are ready to accept the fact that it would be patriotic if members of their family died. Nobody thinks a thing about the Shah, and whoever would have kidnapped him in the first place, who wanted the drug market, has it now, because, as I say, he's tucked in his place. And Jimmy Carter has been strategically perfect to Annapolis, Navy intelligence, the Trilateralists, the oil companies. They're talking about more 50-cent tax on every gallon of gas. The oil has gone up tremendously, the gasoline, our expenses. We're paying for this, and we're paying for the war. But he has served those masters right down the line and given them everything they wanted, which was really a stroke of genius in the past 3 years. I will be making a tape next week, but it won't be there in time to give to you. If we wish you happy holidays, happy Hanukkah, and Merry Christmas, whatever you celebrate. We celebrate all of them. And enjoy the holidays. And the world is crazy. The leaders are crazy. Most of the people are insane. It looks dismal, but I never get discouraged. I still find life challenging and interesting, and keep your spirits up and do the best you can and look at the world for a lot of the good and fight for the things that are good and work for what's good and right and have fun. The holidays are a time to have fun, so enjoy yourself, and I'll be back with you next week. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, and you take care, and we'll meet again. It'll be just before Christmas next week.